All right. So I'm here to talk about ending the game for credential theft with Windows 10. Let me start with an introduction. I am Yogesh Mehta. I am the lead PM. I work on the operating system security team as part of the Windows and Devices group. And my focus area is identity. So I work on Windows Hello for Business, all of the authentication protocols in Windows, the crypto and PKI stack, and I also work on credential theft protection. So what are we going to cover today? I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what are the objectives and what I expect you to take away from this session. So the goals of this session are to go over Credential Guard, and I'll also talk about how to deploy it, what are some of the limitations you need to be aware of. Then I'll move into discussing Remote Credential Guard. Remote Credential Guard is a new feature that we introduced as part of the anniversary update. I'll explain how it protects credentials from attackers on the remote desktop servers. And we'll again talk about deployment and limitations in case of Remote Credential Guard as well. The idea here is to help you understand how these different protection technologies complement each other, and with understanding that no one protection can cover all surfaces, why you would need Credential Guard in some scenarios, why you would need Remote Credential Guard in other scenarios. And most importantly, if there is one thing you take away from this session, it's go try this out. I know some of you may have already looked at Credential Guard. If you are on our insider program, you probably have looked at the Remote Credential Guard or just tried it out as it came out. But the main thing that I'm looking for is feedback. I'm looking for folks who can try these technologies out, understand how they help you in your environment, and then give us feedback. And just one note, I'll save time for question and answers towards the end. And please use the mics in the room so that everybody else can benefit from your questions. So let's start with discussing the landscape today. This was in the news last week. Yahoo revealed a massive data breach of 500 million accounts, and it wasn't just a breach of passwords. It was a breach of password information. It was a breach of all the Q&A that goes into resetting a password, as well as personal information about these users. This was probably one of the biggest data breaches we have seen in the recent past. And it is clearly not the only one. This is another big one that happened last year, where for the United States Office of Personnel Management, OPM, there was a hack that pretty much every user in their system, their accounts were stolen. The relevance of this is you're talking about government employees who themselves have access to sensitive data. So this was one of the most significant breaches that has happened in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of the impact. And credential theft doesn't apply just to big organizations or government situations. This is just an example of someone like Mark Zuckerberg. His Twitter, LinkedIn, and Pinterest accounts were stolen. And in his case, just an anecdote, he had the same password across all 3 accounts. So what we have seen over the years is credential theft or attacks in general have evolved over time. If you think 10, 15 years ago, the primary motivation of cyber attackers was mischief. It was script kiddies trying to get into systems and just wreak havoc. Then it turned into more of a organized crime, where the motivation was theft, fraud, monetary motivations. And then more recently, and this is where things get really, really bad, is it's about damage and disruption. Things that we have seen with Target, with Sony. Even Yahoo in their release talked about the attack being a nation-sponsored or a state-sponsored attack. So the attacks have gotten sophisticated. And how do we respond? How do we make sure our systems are up and running and can protect against these attacks? So just to kind of give you a sense of how bad it is or how prevalent these attacks are, here's a famous quote from James Comey. There are two kinds of big companies: those that have been hacked and those who don't know they have been hacked. So in order to protect against this, this is the holistic view that we take in terms of Windows 10 security. It spans various areas of protection. It includes device protection. This is where we talk about device integrity, controlling your devices. And that's coupled with threat resistance, which includes things like device guard, using the latest and greatest defenses built into Microsoft Edge and Windows Firewall. The next important aspect is protecting identities. This is where we talk about replacing passwords with Windows Hello and leveraging technologies that we will go in depth today, such as credential guard and remote credential guard. The third big aspect of protection, so we talk about device protection, identity protection, and information protection, or data protection. Again, in this space, historically, we have had BitLocker, which is your protection mechanism against offline attacks. With Windows 10, we introduced Windows Information Protection, which can help you protect against accidental data leaks. We have had sessions on Device Guard, Windows Hello, Windows Information Protection, and Windows Defender across the span of this event. And another new technology we introduced as part of Windows 10 anniversary update is the Windows Defender ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection. This gives you a sense of what's going on in your organization from a monitoring standpoint. And if a breach occurs, it allows you to trace how it occurred, what was the exact workflow that the attacker took. So today, for this session, we are going to focus on identity protection, and specifically on credential theft protection. So before I talk about how to protect against credential theft, I want to spend some time on going over what is credential theft. Some of you in the room might be familiar with pass the hash or lateral traversal attacks, but let's spend some time on just understanding what those attacks are, and that will help us then go into how we protect against those attacks. So before we talk about credential theft, even before that, let's just start with the basics. What are credentials? Now, people who have been around technology and security generally understand the use of username and password as a credential that the user uses. Another example of credentials is certificate and public keys. If you're using Windows Hello, if you're using PKI or smart cards, you're using asymmetric key-based credentials. But these are not the only credentials that are interesting in the context of credential theft. It's usually the derived credentials that have a bigger risk when it comes to credential theft. And these are keys that are derived and are actually in use in the system and something for the attacker to go after. So this includes, if you think about NTLM, it includes the NT one-way function, or NT OWF. And if you think about Kerberos, it includes the long-lived session keys, the ticket granting ticket key, and the service ticket keys. So when we think about credential theft, we don't just focus on protecting against password theft or key theft. It's also about protecting against these derived credentials. Now, the other aspect of credential theft has to do with how bad things can get on a system once an attacker gets admin access. Now, again, if you think about the good guy, what can an admin do? Well, a good guy will probably just access things that he or she has access to. Those are part of the local admins group. But the bad guys, the guys who are trying to break into the system, these are guys who will elevate to system, right? They're not running as admin, but they can elevate to the highest level of privilege on the system. And once they do that, they can run pretty much anything on the system, run drivers with kernel privileges. And most importantly, they get access to the secrets that are usually only available to the local system authority, or LSA. So this is really the crux of credential theft attacks, is an admin gets onto the system, elevates to the local system privilege, and then gets access to the secrets on the system. What do they do from that point on? So how these attacks work is, first step, get privilege on the device. Second step, read these secrets. These secrets are usually protected to local system, but once your system, you have access to these secrets. And then use those secrets to attack other devices in the environment. And this is basically, you repeat until you get to something really significant. And that's usually the domain admin privilege in the system. So we're just going to go over an attack that actually occurred. This was, I believe this is tied to the, one of the German parliament hacks that happened. So what happened in this case was this bad guy, attacker, starts off with a spear phishing email that goes out to a set of users in the organization. Now, usually, people have heard about spear phishing attacks. They are a little bit more aware these days. So you could have, of the 3 users, 2 users don't click on that email. They didn't open that link. But maybe the one guy does. The interesting thing here is because of pass the hash, you can still get to those other guys who haven't even opened that email. And here's how. So you get to that one person who gets the, who opens the email, malware runs, you get access to the secrets in their system. You use those secrets to then attack other devices in the environment. So you get to the next device. It may have access to more resources, such as file servers. That's how you get to the file server. That then may have access to the domain controller. And finally, you get to the DC, and you get to all the domain credentials on the device. So we talked about how these attacks work, but why do these attacks work? So there are really 3 conditions that are true that make these attacks possible. 1, credentials are available for the attacker. If the credentials are never available on the system, there is nothing to steal, there is no attack, right? So one of the properties of a credential theft attack is going after availability of credential. Now, it isn't just enough if the credential is available. It needs to be extractable. It needs to be something that I can take out and use, right? So it needs to be something I can remove from the device. And then if it's something I can remove, but I cannot reuse anywhere else, then the attack doesn't really work. So it needs to be usable. The reason we talk about these is it helps us then focus on addressing and attacking each of these properties to reduce the scope of credential theft attacks. And that is really the underpinning of what Credential Guard tries to achieve. It goes after availability, extractability, and usability of the credentials. So how do we do that? So what is Credential Guard, or what is the problem it's trying to solve? Credential Guard uses virtualization-based security to protect domain account, and I'll reiterate this, we only protect domain account credentials in the current releases. So that is your Kerberos and NTLM credentials from theft by malicious software, right? And we are protecting both the logon session, so if I log on to my device with my domain account, or if my domain account credentials are in the Credman. That's the scope of what Credential Guard is protecting against. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about virtualization-based security. If some of you attended the keynote and the Windows 10 general session, we covered a bunch of stuff about virtualization-based security and some of the scenarios that have been introduced even recently, such as Windows Defender Application Guard, that leverage virtualization-based security. So what is this? So if we go back and look at Windows 7, this is how the stack looked like at a very high level. Right? You had kind of the hardware, and you had the kernel running on top of it. You had all the Windows platform components, and then you had apps. All of this was running in a single box from a conceptual standpoint. So if I get hold of the malware, if I have bad code running in the Windows platform, I can get to the kernel. I have taken over the entire box. That wasn't enough. So we looked at how we can make this better. Right? And the analogy that makes sense here is how would you protect your resources if you're building a fort? And this is a story about the Carcassonne fort, where first what you do is you build the wall. This is the external wall you build, try to protect everything. But you have certain things within your boundaries that are more valuable than others. In the context of Credential Guard and credentials, it's usually the secrets that are stored as part of the LSA. So you try building another wall, but then you really want to focus on those little pieces of the puzzle where you have the most secure and the most important resources. Another way to think about it is if you go to a bank, you have your locker in there, or if you're at home, you have a safe. So you lock your home, but then your important stuff is stored in the safe. And it's the same concept that applies here. So what we do is we leverage hypervisor-based security to essentially isolate certain pieces of the operating system that are more secure and that are resilient to admin-level malware. So you're running these trustlets, and Device Guard is an example of this. We talked about Device Guard in another session, and Credential Guard is an example of this. So what we do is we isolate LSA and the secrets and have that run within this isolated environment that admin-level malware does not have access to. So why is this better? It's really about reducing the attack surface. That's simply the benefit that we get out of this. If you don't have Credential Guard, your attack surface is essentially the entire OS, because everything is running in the same box. But with Credential Guard and with virtualization-based security, you are not releasing these domain credentials or domain user secret to the OS, to the admin. These are now isolated, and now your attack surface is reduced to the firmware or the hypervisor. So again, just to make sure we are on the clear about what we protect today, the scope of Credential Guard covers domain credentials. So if the logon session is NTLM, we are looking at the NTOWF. If you're using Kerberos, we protect the username and password until you derive and you get the TGT. And from that point on, it's the long-lived session keys and the TGT keys that are all isolated in the isolated LSA. And then if you're using stored domain credentials from Credential Manager, those are also protected by Credential Guard. When you think about deploying Credential Guard in your environment, there are a few things to note. To deploy Credential Guard, we do not have any DC requirements. This is something you can deploy with your existing DCs. When it comes to device requirements, you need to be running on the client side the TH2 or the 15.11 release of Windows 10. Or you need to be running Windows Server 2016 from a server standpoint. For virtualization-based security, the requirements boil down to having x64 architecture with the virtualization extensions enabled. And that also includes support for UEFI 2.3.1 and Secure Boot. One important thing I want to call out is TPM. We support both TPM 1.2 and TPM 2.0. In general, TPM 2.0 is recommended. It has other benefits that go beyond Credential Guard in terms of reliability of the TPM and reducing any lockout behavior when it comes to things like Hello and BitLocker. But TPM 1.2 will also work in terms of Credential Guard. And we get this question a lot. I have a ton of devices in my organization. How do I know which devices will support Credential Guard? So recently, we released a Device Guard and Credential Guard hardware readiness tool. If you run this tool, it can very easily help you understand if the device is ready to support Credential Guard and Device Guard. Does it have the support for virtualization? I have a link to this, and I also have references later on. If you're looking to deploy Credential Guard or Device Guard, we highly recommend you try this tool out. It will make it much easier to detect which devices will support Credential Guard in your environment. And please give us feedback on this tool. It's something we just recently released. Now, how do you enable Credential Guard? So if you want to enable Credential Guard in your environment, we have a group policy available for you. And I'm just going to quickly show you that. So this is what it looks like, and I'll pull it up here so you can get a good sense of where it's available. So if you go to your group policy settings, under computer configuration, admin templates, system, device guard, this is where we have the options available to turn on virtualization-based security. And in here, when you turn on virtualization-based security, so that enables VBS on your system, and you go into Credential Guard configuration, and you enable Credential Guard. We have certain options available in there that has details on how you want to get, whether you want the DMA protections or not. But it's as simple as going through enabling VBS first, and then enabling credential guard as part of it. We also have scripting available through the tool I mentioned. So if you want to just use that tool and use the tool to turn on CredGuard, that's also something you can do and avoid going through GP. That is supported as well. So I talked about what we protect. I also want to be very clear about what is currently not protected. This will help you understand as you start testing it, if things don't work, is it a bug or is it something that we just don't support currently in the current release of Windows 10? So these are examples of credentials that are not protected by Credential Guard. This includes your local SAM accounts. So if you're using local accounts, those are not protected by Credential Guard. Microsoft accounts, again, the scope today is limited only to domain accounts. So if you're looking at any consumer devices where users are using MSA to sign in, those credentials are currently not under the Credential Guard protection. Azure Active Directory accounts, same thing, not currently in scope. And any credentials that are managed by applications, because this is highly integrated with LSA and with Curb and NTLM. If the app is using any credentials and storing those in CredMan, those won't be covered. Only the domain credentials will be covered. One of the things that will help us is if you give us feedback. We are looking at adding support for these over, as part of our roadmap. But what really helps us make sure we are focusing on the right ones is your feedback and your scenarios that need support for these type of protections. A few other things to consider as you look at deploying CredGuard in your environment. We currently don't support any third-party SSPs. The most important one that we get a lot of questions about is we don't support NTLM v1. If you're still using NTLM v1, we highly recommend that you move away from it. And that's one of the reasons why we did not add support for NTLM v1 when CredGuard was developed. The implication of this, and I want to call this out, is if you're using MS-CHAP v2 for your VPN, that is not going to work with CredGuard. What it means is CredGuard is not going to protect those credentials. So every time the user tries to connect, they will be prompted for credentials. So you lose SSO. Again, we recommend moving to EAP TLS and having stronger protection for your network connections. And currently, we don't support unconstrained delegation with Curb. So once you have enabled CredGuard, how do you figure out if it's enabled correctly? Right? It's important once you have gone down this path, enable CredGuard, how do you monitor it? So we have done some things that make it very easy to understand whether CredGuard is running or not. So if you run msinfo32, which I'll also show you a quick example of. I have it open here. So if you run msinfo32 under system summary, you will have whether CredGuard is currently configured or not. You'll also have other information about things like whether your device supports virtualization-based security, whether it's enabled or not. And this will, again, very easily help you figure out and monitor if CredGuard is running. If somebody in your organization complains of an issue and you quickly want to check if CredGuard is running on the device, just ask them to run msinfo32. We also have scripting available through the tool I mentioned that can allow you to monitor CredGuard. The other thing to note is if CredGuard is correctly deployed and running, you will see this event we log in the event log. The reason I want to call this out is I know some of you use event log monitoring and SCOM, and you can use these events to key off and make sure CredGuard is correctly enabled. So there's an event ID 14 that will tell you whether the configuration is enabled correctly. And then when CredGuard starts and LSA credentials are protected, we also log an event that will then help you understand that it's actually running. Some few considerations if you're troubleshooting CredGuard. We again have events available for you. So as you're deploying this and testing this, these events will help you from a troubleshooting standpoint. So we log errors and warnings if things like your CredGuard is configured, but the secure kernel or the VBS platform is not running, or if things failed to launch or we had errors. There's a lot more detail about this on TechNet. The point here is to just call out some of the key things we have in the platform that allow you to monitor and troubleshoot CredGuard. So I'm going to skip the demo. If you want to see a demo of CredGuard, this was demoed as part of the main keynote and demoed how CredGuard works. And it's a fairly simple demo where if you run Mimikatz on Windows 7, you can get the user's password. And if you run Mimikatz on Windows 10 running CredGuard, it will not reveal the user's password. So if you want to learn more about CredGuard, I highly recommend the Microsoft Virtual Academy session. So while I got to spend about 20, 30 minutes on CredGuard, that session runs much longer and does a deep dive with the development team. We also have a lot of information about VBS and the Windows 10's virtual mode, virtual secure mode on channel 9. I recommend looking at all these sessions. They give you a good insight into how VSM and isolated user mode works. And then we have this article which talks about a lot of the things I covered, but in a much more depth. And it also gives you information about how to script deployment, how to monitor, how to troubleshoot in a lot more depth. So please take a look at these resources when you get back. So with that, that was CredGuard. Again, CredGuard was introduced. It's available since the TH2 release. Depending on whether you are on CBB or whichever deployment of Windows 10 you're running, Credential Guard is there. What we added in the anniversary update or the 1607 release is Remote Credential Guard. So I want to spend some time now on Remote Credential Guard and help you understand how that can help you in your environments. So we talk about pass-the-hash attacks, which are very popular. It's become almost a term that everybody uses to refer to breaches and APTs. But there is another attack that is just as interesting. And this often happens in the context of help desk. So let's say there is someone in your organization whose machine has a problem. It's not running. It probably has malware on it. But the person yet doesn't know. So they call up help desk. Usually what happens is the help desk guy then remotes into that device to check out what's going on. And when that happens, if you have malware on the device and somebody is connecting over remote desktop, now that help desk admin or network admin credentials are stolen, because when you connect over remote desktop, you are still presenting your credentials to the remote host. So this is the attack that Remote Credential Guard protects against. So there are existing solutions, and this is also something we introduced in this same space, which is restricted admin. How many of you are familiar with restricted admin with remote desktop? I see a few hands go up. So restricted admin is a capability that is available today. It's part of Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 that allows you to restrict what the admin credentials can be used for. But the problem with restricted admin is it has a few limitations that make it hard to use and hard to deploy. Number one, it requires the user to be admin. So if I'm connecting as a non-admin, restricted admin does not protect my credentials. Secondly, restricted admin only allows outbound connections to use the remote host identity. It does not support using the user identity to connect outbound. So if I log into a remote machine and want to connect outbound to a file server or a web server using my user identity, restricted admin will not work with that. And there is no multi-hop remote desktop connection support. So that means if I remote into one machine, I cannot then remote into other machines and hop from that device. So these are limitations with the current restricted admin feature we have. So with Remote Credential Guard, we address these limitations. Now, how do you deploy this in your environment? Again, we like to call out because it's important to understand there are no DC requirements. You don't need to upgrade your DCs to deploy Remote Credential Guard. There are requirements for both the remote host and the remote desktop client. So when it comes to the remote host, the machine that you are connecting into, that needs to be running either the anniversary update. Again, this was a new feature that we introduced as part of the RS1, the anniversary update release. It requires to be domain joined. Actually, both the remote host and the remote desktop client are required to be domain joined. I'll explain a little bit later why we require that. And it kind of extends the restricted admin feature, so we leverage the same opt-in, the same policy. So you require restricted admin to be enabled to opt into this. So that's kind of a baseline for the remote host. In terms of remote desktop, we require it to be domain joined. As part of a V1 that we have introduced in the anniversary update, we only protect logon session credentials. So if you're logging on or using the same credentials that you used to log on to connect over remote desktop, those will be protected. But if you want to supply credentials in the remote desktop client, those are not supported yet. And we need line of sight to DCs. Again, I'll go into that a little bit more as I talk about how this works. So why is this better? This is almost kind of looking at the problems we have with restricted admin today and addressing those and making it easier to use and deploy. So number one, as a non-admin user, if I connect over a remote desktop connection, those credentials are now protected using a remote credential guard. Outbound connections are as a user's identity. So if you want to use your user identity to connect outbound from the remote host, that is supported. Multi-hop remote desktop connections are supported. Again, we haven't tested this for 100 hops, for example, but the point here is you can now connect to a device, hop from that into another device, and that type of protection is supported. The other thing to understand is when the client disconnect. So usually what happens is if you're using remote desktop, and I connect from one machine to another machine, and I want to have certain things run on that machine, I can disconnect, and those existing things will continue to work. So if I have existing authenticated connections on the remote host, they will continue to work until your ticket expires. But you cannot make any new authenticated connections. And this is simply because with remote credential guard, there are no credentials available on the remote host. So you cannot start any new connections. You can use existing connections because you have a ticket, and you can use that until that expires. So what credentials are protected? Kind of taking the same approach that we used when we talked about credential guard. We protect the user's password. This is simply because we never share that user password over the network to the remote host. We protect the NTOWF, and we also protect, in terms of domain credentials, the same thing, the long-term keys used by Kerberos and the TGT session keys. Things we don't protect. So if you are directly going to the, if you remote into a machine, so I'm connecting from my client into a remote host, and then I type in credentials on the remote host, we don't protect that because you're not going over the, we are only protecting the credentials that you supply as part of the remote connection. And we don't protect the service ticket session keys because today those service ticket session keys are still needed to maintain those existing connections that are running even after you disconnect. So how do you configure this? So again, I'm going to be fully transparent about what's available today. There are some improvements we are making, and they are in the pipeline. But today, if you want to enable remote credential guard on the remote host, you effectively want to enable restricted admin. As I said, this is an extension to restricted admin, and we are leveraging the same capabilities available for restricted admin. So the way to do that is to set this registry key where we are the registry is called disable restricted admin. So when you set it to 0, that when you're actually enabling the feature, you're enabling restricted admin. And just an example, this is reg key, you can easily script it. This is what you need to do on the remote host. For the client, again, we have GP available. So it's in the same place that I showed earlier, right next to it. So if I go back to group policy, now you are looking at admin templates, system, credential delegation, restrict delegations of credentials to remote devices or remote servers. So again, this was the existing policy that we had. And what we have done is, in addition to require restricted admin, which was previously supported, we now have prefer remote credential guard and require remote credential guard. Just to explain the difference between prefer and require, if you set prefer, what we would do is we would try to use remote credential guard, and we would fall back to restricted admin if that cannot be used for any reason. And if you require remote credential guard, then that will not fall back to restricted admin. It will either fail or it will just work over remote credential guard. Also to point out, it says supported on Windows 8.1 and 2012 R2. This is again because we are using an existing GP that was supported in 8.1 for restricted admin. We have taken that and we have extended it to support remote credential guard. So if you're deploying remote credential guard in your environment, what are some of the things you need to think about? So the way remote credential guard works is we are not revealing those credentials back to the server because we are never sending them in the clear. We send those credentials encrypted to a key that is only available on the client, which means we can only protect the user's signed on credentials today. And once you could disconnect from the remote host, that's why you cannot make any new connections, because those connections or credentials were encrypted to the client that was originally connected to it. Because we are not sending any credentials over, it's the remote hosts that need to obtain Kerberos service tickets, right, for connecting to any resources that they need to. So that is the reason why today, accessing resources requires line of sight to DCs. Going back to the types of accounts we support, again, as I said, similar to how we have done credential guard, we started with domain accounts. We currently don't support local accounts, MSA accounts, or AAD accounts for remote credential guard. That's something we are looking into. I would appreciate your feedback in the same context. Which are the credentials and the scenarios that are most interesting to you when it comes to remote desktop? Today, if your users are supplying credentials or using prompted credentials, that support is not in the anniversary update. It's something my team is looking at right now, and we hope to have that available soon. But again, it's limited to signed-in credentials. And we have limitations with compound authentication. So one of the things I just want to call out is remote credential guard. It's kind of like what I like to call a V1 feature. It has capabilities available for logon credentials. It's something I would really encourage you to try out, test out. It is better than restricted admin. And it will help you also understand within your environment what are some of the things that work with it. And if you run into issues, give us feedback. We are looking to improve this. As I said, there are some limitations here that may make it harder in certain environments. We understand that, and we are working on addressing that. So if you want to learn more about remote credential guard, we have an article up available on TechNet. It talks about how to enable remote credential guard. It also talks about some of the limitations. Please take a look and try this out. So before we close and leave enough time for questions, here is some of the other sessions that we have available. As you're looking at credential theft and identity in general, we have a session on device guard. I believe most of these sessions happened already, but you can take a look at the recordings. We talk about Windows Hello and some of the investments we have made in that space in the current release. And one of the interesting sessions I would encourage looking at is Credential Guard is currently enabled for all users as part of Microsoft IT. And that was a significant deployment at scale. And how did MSIT do it? What are some of the challenges they ran into? And how did they address it? So there's a session from our IT team that talks about what they learned. So that's the last one here, which talks about kind of how they took a look at this, what they learned. When you're looking at broad deployment of things like Credential Guard or Windows Hello, we strongly recommend looking at that MSIT session. So I want to go back to where we started, right? We want to help you understand Credential Guard and what are its limitations. The most important one, there's one thing you want to take away. It works only for domain accounts today. Remote Credential Guard, if you're using it on servers or clients, make sure they are running Windows Server 2016 or the latest release, the 1607 release of Windows 10. And last but not the least, I'll reiterate, please try both these technologies out. They are relatively easy to set up, but as you try them out, we would love to hear your feedback, and that would help us go back and improve the product. Last but not the least, please sign up for the Windows Insider program if you haven't done already. We will be releasing builds regularly as part of the Windows Insider program and help you, with improvements. So I budgeted about 20 minutes. I think we have a little bit more than that for questions. So at this point, questions are welcome. Please use the mic in the room. Thank you.